Dr. Eleanor Drage, the host of the Good Robot podcast. Join me as I ask the experts, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism and other justice-seeking movements help us work towards it? If you want to learn more about today's topic, there's a full transcript of the episode at thegoodrobot.co.uk, along with an especially curated reading list by every guest. I love hearing from listeners, so feel free to reach out on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, or through my Cambridge email address. And don't forget to leave a review on whichever platform you're listening from. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. It's amazing to have you here. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm with Crystal Abidin, who is Professor of Internet Studies at Curtin University, and you're an anthropologist, an ethnographer of Internet Studies, and you focus especially on the Internet, with Internet celebrity and influencer cultures being key specialties, also social media pop cultures, and mostly in the Asia Pacific region. So lots of hot topics. And you've written plenty of really awesome government reports that I've looked at that seem extremely helpful, and white papers on social media and regulation, which is now so crucial. And we're really talking about it in the UK, including the regulation of child influencers and global exchanges on TikTok. And I can't wait to hear more about this. So you've just been to London and you've been promoting your book, TikTok and Youth Cultures. And I wish you a great success in doing that. So welcome, Crystal.
Thank you, Elena. Thanks for having me.
So firstly, can you tell us, what do you do, aside from my short ramble, and what brings you to the topic of feminism or justice, gender, and technology?
I primarily study what people do online and how internet cultures evolves in the far corners of society, and the impacts of how these changing cultures may infringe upon or improve the lives of people in the margins. Now, many of these quote-unquote people in the margins happen to be women and gender diverse peoples. They also happen to be people of various minority ethnic groups in different societies and have to find ways to contest with the visibility they have or do not have in society versus what a different kind of reality might be on social media. So by default, in looking at things like equity, social justice, social movements, and the ways they circumvent everyday authorities, censorship, algorithms, user groups, and the like, I can see through the ways technology is impacting us, but the ways technology is also helping us be creative in pushing back against these newest evolutions in society.
So our three good robot questions are: what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can we get there? Or how can pro-justice ideas help us get there? And I was thinking about social media as now in popular media, hotly debated whether it is actually a bad technology. But of course, it's far more ambivalent than that. So where do you stand on this question of good technology in relation to social media?
Social media is good technology in the right hands for the right people, bad in the wrong hands for the wrong people. It is a cop-out answer, but it's very genuine coming from an anthropologist, because the crux of the matter is, where do you stand in relation to power structures? Given standpoint theory, if you're standing with the upper echelons of society, those are primarily the people who construct and produce technology. So whether it's entrepreneurs catering to users, engineers working through features and designs, or maybe even policy workers being the ombudsman of morality based on community guidelines that they set, these are the folks that get a say in what trickles down to the rest of society. Good technology can look like bad technology when it doesn't serve the common good, when people on the fringes are disproportionately absorbing the spillover effects and consequences, or when the productive advantages are not evenly spread out through the top to the bottom tail of society. So the very same technology all at once can be good, bad, in between, depending on who you ask, also depending on when you ask it. Oftentimes, following the hype cycle, things that are new, shiny, and sexy come across as the savior for whatever problem we're facing with. This was the case with mobile media, then social media, Then messaging groups and latest hype that we have, big data, all the way down to AI and now generative AI. And of course, as these ideas become mainstream, people who start using them and testing them on a daily basis start to uncover all the nooks and crannies, turn over every rock, and find out that behind the good are poor inequities and very terrible structural discrimination. Let's think about, say, the content moderators who are literally holding up the internet, making sure that content that filters through passes censorship. Let's think about the workers who are assembling phones in very poor working conditions at the consequence of their health. Let's think also about the people who are guinea pigs testing technologies, volunteering their data, their time and labor in order to improve something in beta before it gets launched. So it's about timing where we stand in society and what we can take away for it, which means good technology is good for some people and not for others.
So even if I'm scrolling through content at a time of day when it's not impacting my offline life and it's only 5 minutes of heated rivalry content rather than 45 minutes of something that might be more distressing to me, the way that a technology is created and the infrastructure make it either good or bad. There is still a fundamental ambivalence, but you cannot have good technology if the labor, if the natural materials and resources that go into it have been extracted in a way that is fundamentally negative to the planet.
Yeah, so from a sociological point of view, if you were to extrapolate and take a bird's eye view of power structures, even if something benefits you personally, the benefit that trickles down to you is at the expense of someone else or something else. And then from an anthropological point of view, cultures that seem inane, mundane, mainstream, tacit, accepted to you might be violently disagreeable with somebody else next door or across the street. So, depending on whether you are someone who is concerned about the interconnectedness of everyone in society, depending on whether you're someone who is keenly aware of cultural relativism and the fallbacks of ethnocentrism, these may or may not be front of mind questions for you.
Absolutely. And there's something that we're not encouraged to think about by the tech companies that obscure all those things beneath the shiny, exciting facades of their technologies. But let's just park these difficult moral questions for a second and talk about TikTok. So you are one of the most prominent scholars of these social media platforms, and I'd love to hear from you. How did TikTok begin? Where did it come from? And how were people onboarded?
In my book, TikTok and Youth Cultures, I argue that there are myriads of origin stories. So many, in fact, that I'm only going to pick one, and that's not even the complete story, just for us to get the conversation going. If you were to ask someone who is in Gen Z, they would tell you TikTok is parasiting two predecessor apps. One, Dubsmash, two, Musically. Dubsmash was this really popular app where young people would dub over any kind of video materials, sometimes dubbing accurately word for word such that they go viral for their technical skill, sometimes being really savvy, ironic, and cynical, and being able to decode contrasting messages in it so people enjoyed it, or sometimes having sheer theatrics, eyebrow movements, facial expressions, being able to perform well so people enjoyed the recreation. Dubsmash trained a whole cohort of young people on how to take a source content and remix it. Musically, in its heyday, was primarily known as a dance app. It was a sort of app where, with background music, young people would create dances mostly with their upper body and their hands, sort of like Para Para Sakura style if you're a millennial like me and familiar with those arcade game machines from the 90s. And there was scripts here. Which songs followed which designs, how to orchestrate your hand movements, your finger placements, etc. Now, TikTok, in its predecessor form, existed as an app known as Douyin from the Chinese domestic market. It at that time was a short video app that encouraged people to come on board and sing, like a sing along karaoke style kind of app. As it was expanding and deciding to launch internationally, the company absorbed Musically, which of course was heavily influenced by Dubsmash, and we see how one of the first cohorts globally of young people on TikTok just happened to be the people attributed from Musically and Dubsmash that being Gen Z who brought their creativity there. Now, if you were to ask this question to an entrepreneur, to a government regulator, perhaps to even people who onboarded on TikTok when it became mainstream during the pandemic, these would bring you very different answers. But the long and the short for a first origin story or a taster is that Gen Zs were onboarded because they were going after the next big thing. The next big thing was bought over, parasited, absorbed, and that's where they had their mass migration to TikTok.
What were some initial first experiences of the platform? Because it was very different then than it is now.
100%. Here in Australia, where I live and work, TikTok in the heyday, I would say about 2019, was used as a civics movement app. It was mostly where young people were practicing citizen journalism, primarily because here we've got the annual bushfire season in summer, with global warming really impacting this part of the world. And so during bushfire season around December 2018, January 2019, and again in December 2019 and January 2020, young Australians across the country were taking to TikTok to showcase what life was really like during the season. People who live in the bush, in the regional areas, were sharing short snippets of how wildlife were escaping into their compounds, how they were helping to rescue koalas, how they were trying to bring to attention governments, policymakers, stakeholders, even teachers that climate change was something they were very passionate about. This, of course, coincided with the global student protests led by Swedish girl Greta Thunberg. And so we saw this very nice symbolic collective effervescence of young people on TikTok using it for their own grassroots-based social justice movement. That is an origin story I think we now tend to forget because the discourse that's easier to digest, that doesn't really require this fidelity to history, is that young people are just dancing on the app, or that they're just doing funny stunts on the app, or that's become a dance and music app that gets people popular or famous overnight, or so the Netflix documentaries tell us. But in reality, TikTok is many things for many different people, and I'm very grateful to have been there from the beginning, at least to document several of these origin stories.
And the saving wildlife is still very much my favorite content on the internet. I love watching people, shoo little creatures into safety and, in animal welfare centers, cuddle animals that most of us never get to go anywhere near. And I think that's part of the joy of the internet. Particularly in the UK, in our little island, we don't get close to much of the world's wildlife and don't know that much of it exists. So to see it up close and to see these really intimate human animal relationships is a really special thing and certainly fills me with joy.
There was actually a very popular meme from Australia that made it big in the UK during this time. And those of you who remember that time might remember a meme known as Australia is Burning. The funniest version of it I saw were young people in the UK who were putting water from the tap into envelopes, snapping a stamp on it, and saying to Australia, like that little bit of water could help put our bushfires out. It was funny, it was humorous, but in the grand scheme of things, it was young people trying to show solidarity through humor. And humor is often the way they lubricate very difficult conversations and make it palatable for people to have more interactive discussions.
There's a perception, I think, that young people lack humor, that they're sort of overly sensitive or don't have humor. And that's a kind of right wing argument that has been pushed quite successfully, I think, in the UK. But you can see on these apps that there is so much humor and there's a real diversity of humor and a way of approaching the crises that young people live in a way that also has levity. Is that a new thing?
No, I think young people have always been really good at social steganography or hiding messages in plain sight. As once upon a time, young people ourselves, I'm sure we were well versed in leet speak, slang, lingo, and it was something that made us feel camaraderie with people in our generation. It also felt a bit affirming and sneaky that we could have these conversations out and open with people listening and tuning in, but not having the knowledge to decode exactly what we're saying. This is a framework I introduced in prior work a few years ago that I termed refracted publics. It used to be that we would think of publics as networked. The more you share, the more others share of this. And with the networks, something that is shared by yourself can be seen by an audience that you would never know due to just the multiplication of people you're resharing and reposting. Now, with refracted publics, it works in this way too, except that while you've got access to the info, you may not have the legibility to decode what it actually means. We also have to think about this in tandem with parody culture and sarcasm. If you only have basic knowledge of something, you may decode just a very basal level of how this is just comedy or humor. But if you're in the know and you can tell the signs and you know the symbols and you know the language, more importantly, if you're there at the right time and you know the issues that are happening, this gives you extra context to decode the political messages, maybe some even subversive conversation happening right before your eyes. And I think it's wonderful that young people, ourselves included, the young people to come, have these types of generational creativity to reach out to each other.
When I think about the in jokes of the internet, one of the things I see a lot is in the cat Instagram community. There was once somebody who spelt cat wrong as car, but of course, cats also make this really, well, they can do aggressive purring sound that does sound a bit like a car. And then everyone started using the term car instead of cat. And these in jokes of the internet, I think, have always been very powerful. So, is there a way that young people take this way of communicating with each other and use it to form groups and solidarities online?
For sure. In TikTok and youth cultures, one of my favorite chapters is memes and capital. And in that chapter, I introduce 5 new types of capital that young people practice on that app. They're niche, subcultural, cross-cultural, discursive, and cross-platform. Now, exactly what you described, Eleanor, falls under this nice umbrella of niche capital. Young people are needing to know, what are the boundaries of humor? What would fall flat with my audience? What would possibly go viral or be memeable in this space? And all of this requires not just digital literacy, not just app based technical literacy, but a subcultural literacy that binds you to people of your cohort to know what sticks and what is stale, what would appeal to, your nice homie on the street versus what would only appeal to grandpa at Thanksgiving or Christmas. And so honing this kind of literacy requires young people to always be in the know, to extrapolate from themselves and their social groups how people would imagine the contents they're putting out there. And it's really training them in skills that I feel can be applied to life later on. It may feel like a bit of a stretch if you're a parent or a teacher to feel like memes can actually be pedagogical and useful, but the reality is they are, because it requires a lot of skill to make one, to decode one, to have one successfully circulate. And more often than you know, these memes are not just carrying humor, they're carrying subtext, decoding messages, and sometimes even political messaging that young people would really like to get out there to their target audiences.
Can it be a real challenge, though, for neurodivergent kids to tap into this humor or perhaps a shared way of communicating online that is difficult to understand? Or, on the other hand, is it a way that it helps neurodivergent kids manage the offline world, which is incredibly confusing emotionally, and understanding the way that people are using language and what they're trying to express? Does the online space give them a little bit more insight into social norms and expectations?
Neurodivergent people, or as TikTok would call them or call us, neurospicy folks, also are a very big subculture and community on TikTok. So it is a wonderful space to find like minded others, literally in this sense, because the design of the algorithm helps to sort people and users into what my colleagues Katrin Tienenberg and Natalie Hendry and I call silo sociality. Rather than think of a network online community, think about TikTok as having very narrow streams, just like silos that hold grain and flour. And the moment you are successfully slotted into just one stream, everything there is very niche, rabbit hole, and deep, esoteric in that specific genre. So you can see how neurodiverse or neurospicy people can really thrive in those spaces if they fall into the correct silos. Now, another beautiful thing about TikTok is that there are often explainers, tutorials, or accounts specifically dedicated to explaining what's happening. And so, whenever something goes viral because it's a trend, the next wave of virality are people producing explainers and tutorials. You might get the info 12 hours late, a full 24 hours late, but at some point, TikTok becomes self referent and there is a whole pipeline of educating people on what the vernacular means. Of course, the moment the vernacular becomes mainstream, i.e., begins to be used by politicians, teachers, or makes headlines in the news, then it becomes stale and young people move on to the next thing altogether.
Yeah, I saw the Pope doing 6-7 in a crowd. I mean, I don't think it's a deep fake, but maybe he's trying to push it away, you know. Who knows what the effect of that will be. So I really want to talk about the ban of TikTok in January 2025. It was a 12-hour plus ban, and new communities, you say, emerged and were spotlighted after. So what happened? What was this ban, if anyone doesn't remember it, and what were the effects?
Because the ban has no concern or respect for people with book production deadlines, my book was sent into print and this happened. I remember being on a plane and feeling like I really needed to write about this because I was still collecting data post submission. And thankfully, my very kind publisher allowed me to add in a late notice epilogue. So I have for us in the book a blow by blow on exactly what unfolded on TikTok itself as the ban happened. Well, for one, when it was first announced, we were seeing the proliferation of curtain calls. TikTok communities were self identifying as American and saying, "This is my eulogy, this is my farewell." It was also a time of a lot of exposes where people who were found to be faking American accents were actually based in the UK. People who were American but actually diaspora based elsewhere and so not impacted by this ban. And so it was a very interesting time of self revelation. During this curtain call, we also had memes that alluded to how young people cared very little for how governments were handling diplomacy. One of my favorite memes that circulated this time were young Americans going, "Goodbye to my personal Chinese spy," and Chinese youth, diaspora and domestic around the world going, "Farewell, my American person that I'm meant to be spying on." And it was all of an inside joke about how, in reality, they would miss the landscape of TikTok, playing into the moral panic that even the granular of everyday life that they're sharing there might be of interest to spies at the diplomatic level. Now, post curtain call, even before the ban, migrations began. Of the different apps that were alternative, Xiaohongshu, also known as Little Red Book, Red Note, or Red, became the go-to destination for a lot of American TikTokers. They were calling themselves TikTok refugees in that space. And at first, it was taken as a joke. Even on Xiaohongshu, lots of the domestic users were saying, "Oh, do you actually know what a real refugee looks like? How bold of you to claim just register. How bold of you to also now be cosplaying what refugees look like. You and your skits and your tattered clothes and makeup, messed up in your face with a suitcase." But soon, with the TikTok refugee discourse, we also saw a lot of pushback because American TikTokers don't happen to be the most kind of peoples on that app. For context, Xiaohongshu, being a Chinese domestic app, contains content primarily in Chinese. So, as American TikTokers were on there, they were commenting on the most viral posts and the biggest users saying, "Speak English. I don't understand what's happening. There are Americans here. This is a global app." And you can see some nationalism, some ethnocentrism, some colonialism also in this discourse that faced a lot of pushback and some tensions arose between both groups. And then the message started to settle in. The ban seemed like it was really going to go forth. Orientalism began to take over. There were Americans on the app trying to mimic Orientalist accents, saying, "This is what I sound like one day on TikTok, sorry, one day on Xiaohongshu, 1 week, 2 weeks, a month." And their English would be deteriorating with exaggerations of what they think a Chinese accent would sound like. It was not tasteful, let's put it that way. And it was really a veneer of digital colonialism in the guise of humor. Now, there were also then these big revelations of TikTokers who were already earning good income on the app, realizing, "I'm going to lose my follower base. I have to shuttle them elsewhere to keep the millions of people I've collected here." So all sorts of memes were baiting followers to follow these TikTokers onto other platforms, especially Instagram, Reels, Xiaohongshu, YouTube, and other legacy platforms. They were dropping bombshells like, we were not really dating, I'm actually gay, my child's not mine, this guy's not my boyfriend, he's my dad. So many people were busting the bubble on either a very long running inside joke, industry secret, or maybe just collapsing their branding altogether in order to get people to follow them for part two of the story. On 19th of January, the app was banned in the US. It was very quiet for a while. And on the internet, without the Americans, people on TikTok kind of celebrated. We called ourselves Commonwealth Talk, Euro Talk, British Talk, Africa Talk, etc. Basically, because of the absence of Americans who were a large volume of users, Global Talk allowed users to see the rest of the world, and content was very different. We got to see a day in the life of folks elsewhere. The landscape for palatable humor was different. Folks were even pushing back on grammar and spelling, my favorite being color, neighbor, humor, centimeters, kilograms, Celsius. And it was all fun at the expense of the missing Americans for all but 14 hours. The next day, Americans returned to TikTok after a full 14 hours of in app from saying that the app was going to be back. And when it did, it also prompted that it was with thanks with the result of President Trump's efforts. It was kind of awkward. The folks coming back after breaking their brand, after the big revelations, after sullying relationships they had with rest of world talkers. But they soon returned, and in the aftermath, there was post grief, post migration, post return, people realizing TikTok actually really is central to our life. We're going to try and recover from it. We're going to continue business as is. I would say it's only about 2 weeks after that this was no longer a conversation and it felt like nothing at all had ever happened. In fact, many of the TikTokers who immigrated to Red Note ended up abandoning their accounts altogether. So you can see now a graveyard of American Red Note accounts that stopped posting right about the time the ban was revoked in January 2025.
Fascinating historical artifacts, digital artifacts that remain there to tell this story. And even though it was only 14 hours, my goodness, did things shift? Did things happen on the platform? And this, for listeners, it was all part of Trump's desire to take over companies that he thought were extremely successful. That was part of it, part of the media rhetoric, and certainly here in the UK. And, Trump decided also that he really wanted to buy NVIDIA, or he felt that this Taiwanese chip manufacturer, hugely successful, should belong to the US. And the same with TikTok. Although I think Trump also had a real fondness for TikTok himself, because he thought he was a TikTok star at one point and was very excited about that. Okay, so finally, influencers. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about them. I want to ask you something slightly different, though. So what do different linguistic cultures call influencers? Because we only hear that word, I think, in the Anglosphere. And how does it vary?
So let's talk about the English-speaking world. I think the tension now is moving from influencer to content creator. But prior to this, it was folks moving from calling themselves micro-celebrities to influencers. And even prior to that, there was a whole plethora of platform-specific terms like blogger, YouTuber, streamer, tweeter, etc. In my research, I broadly refer to all of these categories of figures as internet celebrity because this term focuses on the visibility of these folks rather than the quality of the celebrity, the morality of why they're visible, whether people love or hate them. Now, around the world in different language groups, there are multiple words that may be equivalent or that feel like they're conceptual synonyms. Let's look to China as an example. Wang Hong, literally translating to internet red, feels like the biggest catch-all, like internet celebrity. But Wang Hong also implies something slightly different from internet celebrity. It may refer to people who are popular online, but it primarily refers also to their ability to broker or to parlay their visibility into profit, into income, into getting people to purchase things that they're selling. There are more terms that are specific to practices. For instance, streamers, which are really popular given the rise of live shopping and live stream e-commerce, might be called 直播. You might also see people who are categorized based on their function. So someone who is called a 流量明星 or a volume star is popular because they are able to bring literally volumes of traffic whenever they're online, whatever it is they do. But notice how that doesn't really indicate what they're popular for, whether or not there's e-commerce attached to it. And I find that these Chinese terms in themselves, though platform and practice specific, allow for these nuances to carry through. Across the water, another side of my research also focuses in Korea. One example in Korea would be the insa, and it can be loosely translated to an influencer, but really some of the Gen Zs also use insa to refer to very popular people, people who are famous around kids because of their fashion trends, or maybe even Instagram influencer. A final example, let's look at Japan. Japan has a knack for calling every internet celebrity a YouTuber because for a long time, the one platform that helped to institutionalize making money and platform programs from your online visibility was YouTube. Remember also, Japan already had a very big in domestic celebrity culture that did not need to use the vocabulary of influencers. Japanese idols, for example, idol groups, were already popular on social media, live streaming their performances in underground pubs in order to get an audience before they formally debut with a company. We also had the likes of Hatsune Miku, a Vocaloid that's entirely 3D. We may think of her as a predecessor to the AI or virtual influencers we know of today. But someone like Hatsune Miku, who is entirely a hologram, is also popular in the flesh, holding physical concerts online and software, and an influencer herself promoting different kinds of brands on social media. So why have we ended up calling the influencers in Japan YouTubers? Well, primarily because video is the primary mode or has been the primary mode there for a very long time. And if we were to look at government regulation from Japan, YouTube and YouTubers are more strongly governed because of the ways we are able to measure the duration of their videos, what time of day they should be posting, how clearly they should be announcing whether or not a product is sponsored or whether a message has been paid for. And, a lot of these terms feel like they're interchangeable until you get to that country, that culture, that platform, and realize, nah, they sort of mean very specific things to specific people. If you're an academic or if you're a student working through your lit review, this is probably a pain you know very well. The search terms you use in order to look for the news or the scholarship will also bring you in different directions and highlight different ideologies behind the histories.
Crystal, thank you so much for joining me here today. This was immensely informative. And for everybody listening, go out and buy her brilliant books, including TikTok and Youth Cultures. It was a phenomenal insight into a world that we spend so much time on. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Eleanor. Appreciate this time.
This episode was made possible thanks to Stiftung McArthur and the Leverhulme Trust. It was written and produced by me, Dr. Eleanor Drage, and the editor of this week's episode is credited in the episode's description. Thanks for listening.